Welcome back to Final Fantasy. Previously, we defeated the Water Fiend and restored the Water Orb, I'm pretty sure, and I think, judging from the fact that we're leaving from Melmond, I'm pretty sure we ended off with delivering the slab to Professor Oon, so we could learn the Lefenish language and head to the final town, acquire the last key item we need. I assume it's the last key item we need anyway, and make our way to the final dungeon. It may seem strange to some people that I seem so unsure about what we have or haven't done, especially if you're joining us for the first time, but for those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is not live commentary. I'm looking back on old footage from a playthrough I recorded about 2 or 3 years ago at this point, with the intention of doing this, with the intention of recording commentary while having the footage going on its own. The idea being that I would able to more smoothly discuss my thoughts and history with this game or with the Final Fantasy series as a whole while the gameplay is going, without the gameplay being interrupted or affected by me talking, so to speak. A lot of times if you're doing a Let's Play, you might feel compelled to have to pause the game so you can focus on what you're saying, or stop talking so you can focus on progress, stuff like that. And the whole idea was to alleviate that by recording the game first, and then afterwards doing the commentary while watching the footage back. So I can focus more on talking about this and that without affecting the flow of the game or without affecting my performance in any way, or having the game affect my commentary. And we've come a long way. Hang on. And we've come a long way. Oh, blah, 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 blah. I lost my train of thought. I needed to write down a note. And now I lost my train of thought. But I wanted to say that we've come a long way. And I wanted to lead into that with something. But now, I needed to take a note, and now I forget what I wanted to lead into that with, or whatever. What I wanted that to lead into. But, yeah, blah. So let's just forget that transition that I was trying to do and just say that last time we finished the countdown of my top 10 picks for the Final Fantasy series, which took a lot longer than I expected. Going into it, I thought this'll fill 2 or 3 episodes, but without a script, I can sometimes ramble about certain things, which led to me overly discussing certain aspects of the games. On that list are my certain thoughts regarding those games, which meant I was only able to cover a couple games per episode, and a couple games even lasted longer than that. Just for a quick recap though, because why not? At number 10, we had Final Fantasy X. At number 9, we had, what was that? Final Fantasy II. At number 8, we had, I think Final Fantasy VII? Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy IV. And then, I'm pretty sure it was Final Fantasy VII. And then 7 was Final Fantasy IV. 6, I think, I can't even remember some of these. Like I said during that countdown, some of these entries are very interchangeable, as proof by the fact that I can't even remember them off the top of my head without my notes, despite them being my own opinions. But number 7 and 8 were Final Fantasies 4 and 7, but really those could go either way. like I said during the countdown. Same with numbers 6 and 5. Those were Final Fantasies 1 and 3. I believe I put Final Fantasy 1 above 3 just because I think it's a bit more replayable with how short it is. And some of the jobs, and every job has viability, whereas with Final Fantasy 3, there are certain jobs that just fall off as you go, but that's also that also works well into the game's design, in that you have stronger progression as you go, so to speak. But I could go either way with 3 and 1 as far as the 5th and 6th. And then number 4 was... Number 4 was Final Fantasy 9. Number 3 was Final Fantasy 13. Number 2 was Final Fantasy 5. And number 1 was Final Fantasy 16. As I said, though, with that list was only covering the main series Final Fantasy games, numbers 1 through 16, although when I started this series, Final Fantasy 16 didn't even exist yet, so I couldn't have really had an opinion on it when I even made that list. And also, it didn't count any spin-offs or sequels, nothing like that, none of the Chocobo games, none of the sequels or prequels like the After Years or Crisis Core. And I was also only counting the Final Fantasy games that I feel like I've played enough to formulate a reliable opinion, or at least a somewhat legitimate opinion. That's not to say that I haven't played or experienced some of the other Final Fantasy games, but those experiences have been very limited. First of all, Final Fantasy 11 and 14, I have absolutely zero interest in those games whatsoever because I'm not interested in MMOs. Those just aren't my kind of game. I've played similar types of games. I played a lot of Diablo back in the day when that came out. Never played Diablo 2. I had a friend who was really into Diablo 2, but I never owned that game myself, so I personally never played it. But I played a lot of Diablo, and I actually have a story about Diablo. It was the most fun I ever had with the game. And I created a brand new character. I believe it was a wizard or sorcerer or whatever the game called, the magic user class. I don't remember the exact names of the jobs in that game, but there's generic enough terms that you can get the idea if you're familiar with Final Fantasy games, or not Final Fantasy games, but just fantasy RPGs in general. So I created a brand new wizard, and I just went into it. I just felt like playing some Diablo one evening. And before I even made it into the dungeon, and for those of you who are not familiar with Diablo, it's an action online RPG. You pick from one of 3 classes, the wizard, the warrior, and the ranger, who's basically an archer. And then you just go into the dungeon. The dungeon, I think the dungeon was randomly generated. I don't remember 100%. But I believe the level layouts were somewhat randomly generated, at least. And the idea was you would go into the dungeon, level up, get gear, keep going back into the dungeon and leaving until you were strong enough to make it to the end, which I never did. I never beat the game. But I digress. So I started a new character, and I was a wizard. And before I even made it into the dungeon, I was just wandering around town getting ready to go into the dungeon, and a level 1 warrior joined. And I was like, okay, this is really cool. I just got a random person to join my game. He just showed up. He was also level 1. I was level 1. I was like, this is great. So I have another person to be playing with, and it's not some overpowered guy who's just gonna carry me through the game, because that would have been boring. But it was just a completely random level 1 warrior who just happened to show up. So I'm waiting for him. He's getting ready. He's doing all the stuff I just did, buying gear and items and everything. And I'm just waiting at the entrance of the dungeon for him to show up because I want us to go in together. We go into the dungeon together, and I believe not even halfway through the first floor of the dungeon, a level 1 ranger joins the party. So now just by complete random chance, we have the entire team of 3 job classes all starting fresh from level 1 in this game, and nobody else joined for the entire night. And that was the most fun I ever had with the game, just because of that setup. Not only because we had the 3 level 1 characters. There wasn't any, it was no, like, you started up a new character and then some level 15 guy shows up and you just breeze through the first several floors because this guy just carries you. Or it wasn't like you have a large party of all the same type of guy. There was no discrepancy with levels, and we had the full team. We had the warrior, the wizard, and the ranger, and nobody else joined the entire night. I believe a maximum party in a room or a group or whatever could be 4, but we never got a 4th. It was just the 3 of us, each a different class, each starting from level 1, by 100% pure coincidence. And just that alone made it for such a fun run. I believe we made it up through the first boss, the Butcher, before one of us ended up having, or all of us, whatever, someone ended up having to call it a night. But we got to about that point, and I believe that was also the run where that was, I think, the most fun fight I ever had with the Butcher. Because we're having to run around, I think, what we ended up having to do, because we were not at a high enough level to take this guy head on. So I believe what we ended up having to do is the warrior go in and distract him, and then just run for his life, while me and the archer were just pinging the Butcher from a distance. And then whenever the Butcher would try to come for us, the warrior would get in there and smack him with the sword and then run away to get his attention again. I don't know, it was just a really fun time. That was the most fun I ever had with the game, just because of how genuine and challenging and pure it was. Especially because there were so many cheaters in that game. Heck, I even sometimes cheated in that game. But I felt like there were so many cheaters, or it was so hard to have a balanced team where either you weren't being carried by somebody who is way higher level, or you yourself weren't carrying somebody who is way lower level. It was just this perfect setup, and the fact that it happened purely by coincidence made it all the more better, all the more fun, just knowing that it was just complete happenstance that this match even played out the way that it did. 3 characters, all 3 jobs, all from level 1, within the span of the first 5 minutes of opening the room and starting the game. Anyway, how did I get on? Alright, I was talking about how my countdown didn't include any games that were sequels or blah blah blah, but I have played some of the other Final Fantasy games. Again, like I said, I just remembered what got me into talking about Diablo in the first place was the MMOs. The closest, aside from Diablo, the closest to an MMO I ever played was Phantasy Star Online and Phantasy Star Universe. The former of which I never actually played online. I never had internet connection with the Dreamcast or the GameCube. I don't even think I ever owned Phantasy Star Online for the Dreamcast. I rented it once, but I don't remember if I ever actually owned the Dreamcast version. I might have, but I can't be certain. I owned it on the GameCube, though. And that I played a lot, because it had local multiplayer. So myself, a friend, and my brother, and another friend played it a lot. So yeah. But I definitely associate playing that game more with one friend than the other friend, which is why I started by only saying one friend. And we had some interesting stuff going on in that game as well. Especially because I still remember when we started that game. It was myself, the first friend, and my brother, and we created 3 characters to kind of work together, and we gave them backstories and jobs and all this stuff. And I remember, I'm trying to remember exactly what our job classes were. I think I was a wizard, I think friend was a warrior, and my brother was a ranger, who, in that game though, it's more sci-fi, so instead of bows and arrows, they use guns. And I remember we all had particular roles. I was the advisor, because I was the most knowledgeable of the game, because I'm the one who had actually played it, thanks to the Dreamcast version. Eventually, that role kind of fell off. We kept these roles though, like, day after day, week after week, we kind of fell into these roles that we created for our characters. Even when we were using different characters, we just kind of fell into these roles. And I was the advisor, which became redundant after a while, as everybody else familiarized and played the game and became just as knowledgeable about it as I was. But in the beginning, because I had played through the Dreamcast game, no one else really had played the game much. So I knew the most about it, so I was the advisor. So I'm the person who would be asked stuff like, what do we do against this boss? Or do you think it would be wise to go into this area at these levels? And stuff like that. Or maybe I would give recommendations for equipment, or maybe what techniques to use or learn, or whatever. So that was my job. And then my friend was the bodyguard, which we just kind of assigned to him, I think because he was the warrior, so he was the beefy one. So he was the bodyguard. It was his job to basically get in there, fight, and protect us. Like if somebody was in danger, he would prioritize getting over there and saving them. Even if he was busy fighting an enemy on his own, he would disengage that enemy and get over to the person who needed help. And then my brother we labeled as the party's leader, because I don't remember exactly how that happened. I think it was either his own idea or we just needed a role for him, because I was the advisor because I knew the most about the game. My friend was the bodyguard because he just kind of decided that on his own. I think because of the advisor thing. I think it started with the advisor thing. We decided that I was going to be the advisor of our party. And then the others kind of wanted roles, and it kind of spiraled into that. And my brother became the leader, I think because we just couldn't really think of anything else to apply to him in a role-playing aspect from the perspective of ourselves and applying how we play the game or how we role-play our characters into the game. So we made him the leader, and that was basically it was up to him to make any final decisions. I could offer advice on what we should or shouldn't do, but ultimately whenever it came to what areas we went to, what we decided to do in the game, or whether we should take on a boss, I could offer advice, but ultimately we would have to ask my brother, and he would give the go-ahead on what we would or wouldn't be doing. I would just give my input on whether or not I thought it was a good idea. And then the bodyguard friend didn't really have input on anything like that. He was just there to fight stuff and keep us safe because we were a wizard and a ranged fighter. We didn't have the tough beefiness that he did. Phantasy Star Universe, though, I actually did play online, and I played it a lot. And this may be kind of a controversial opinion, but I personally liked Phantasy Star Universe quite a bit more than Phantasy Star Online. PSO did some things better, and it could just be because I experienced PSU online, but I never experienced PSO online, so part of it could be because there's possibly a lot of content in Phantasy Star Online that I never experienced that may have alleviated the enjoyment of the game. But for one reason or another, everybody loves PSO. A lot of people prefer that game, but I always liked PSU more. And it could be because of those differing experiences or it could be strictly because I just liked a lot of the game's mechanics more. There were a lot of mechanics and aspects of the game that I just genuinely got more enjoyment out of. But it's hard to say with 100% certainty if my reason for preferring PSU is strictly because of the game's content, or if it's partially because there's a lot of online content in PSO that I just never got to experience because I was never able to play the game online. So yeah, that's pretty much my history with MMOs or MMO-type games. There's also... I also played Monster Hunter Ultimate on the Wii U. Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, rather, on the Wii U for a bit. That game, though, I lost interest kind of quickly. Well, I say quickly, but I got like 80 hours into it. But for a game like that, 80 hours isn't very much. And that game I just got bored of because it was nothing but boss battles, and without anything to lead up to the boss battles, the idea of a boss battle loses a lot of its luster, a lot of its significance, a lot of what makes it fun, to the point that the fights were more tedious than enjoyable because they just took a long time. But they stopped being fun because without anything to lead up to them, they no longer felt like boss battles. They just felt like really long and tedious normal battles because there were no normal battles or dungeons or stages to lead up to them to make the boss battles feel significant. And that's also why I've never really played a Monster Hunter game since, because I just don't feel like that formula works very well. I feel like the Monster Hunter formula is self-detrimental because it misses that core aspect of what makes boss battles fun in the first place, is their relationship to the challenges leading up to them. But that's a whole other can of worms, not really worth getting into. So yeah, because of just a general disinterest in MMOs, I've never played Final Fantasy XI or 14, nor do I have any interest in ever playing them. I don't care how good or bad they might be, I'm just not interested in playing them because they're MMOs. Sort of similar story with Final Fantasy 15. In all honesty, if I had a console that had Final Fantasy 15, I would have probably picked up Final Fantasy 15 at some point just because it's a new Final Fantasy game to play, and because it's a Final Fantasy game, I would want to give Square the benefit of the doubt that it's a quality title, even though, from what I've seen, there's a lot of that game that just doesn't really interest me very much. And then lastly, there's Final Fantasy 8 and 12, which admittedly I've only ever really played demos of those games, but from the demos, I didn't like them. I didn't like what I was seeing, what I was experiencing, so I just never really cared to give the actual games a proper shot because the demos left me thinking that I didn't like the games. And I stand by that opinion. If you ask me, do you like Final Fantasy VIII or do you like Final Fantasy XII, I'm going to say no, I don't like them. But for the sake of doing a countdown video, I felt like that wasn't a fair opinion to give, because it's based strictly on playing demos of the games. So I don't feel like that's enough to quantify listing them in relation to the other games in the series, but regardless of that, I do still think that's enough to say that I don't like the games, or at the very least from what I have experienced of them, I'm not interested in giving them a more fair shot because that first impression just left me so uninterested and underwhelmed with what that first impression provided for me. I'll be back in a minute. Getting a bit back on track now, the reason I bring this up is because while there are some side Final Fantasy games and such that I haven't played or didn't really care much for, some of them are great. I really like the Chocobo racing games and a number of the Chocobo games in general, and I also really enjoyed Final Fantasy Tactics. And one of the things that always fascinated me about Final Fantasy Tactics is the fact that you can fight with chocobos. And this is relevant for something I wanted to talk about in this series. So, Final Fantasy Tactics, for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's a tactical RPG as implied by the title, and it uses a job system, much like the closest comparison in the series would be Final Fantasy V, but the job system in Tactics is a lot more elaborate. Personally, I prefer the job system in Final Fantasy V because I feel like, there are just certain problems I have with the job system in Tactics, especially when it comes to how certain abilities make other abilities effectively redundant. That can work in a sense of progression as you go through the game, and certain abilities become obsolete because of other ones to give you a sense of growing stronger as you go. But I don't know, when those abilities are customization options, I really don't like that sort of system. For example, you have an ability called Move +1 that gives the equipped character +1 movement, but then you also have Move +2, so Move +1 eventually becomes redundant. Why use Move +1 when you can use Move +2 instead? And I really don't like that there are skills that become obsolete because of other skills. In certain games, that's fine, but I don't like that when the whole premise is character customization, yet you have multiple customization options that are just worse versions of the other options that you have available. Yes, the stronger options will come later in the game, so there's a sense of progression with the abilities, but that's not what I want when it comes to customizing your characters in that sort of way. I feel like it works in Final Fantasy III because it's not so much about customizing your experience. Yes, there is some customization, but it's not just about that. It's about, I explained it earlier in the series, I think, but If not, then it'll get explained in a later video because I'm kind of rambling at this point, and I do want to talk about something very specific in this video before we run out of time. And at this rate, I might not even get to it. So like I said, in Final Fantasy Tactics, in addition to your human characters that can be customized with all sorts of jobs and equipment and whatnot, there's also monsters. And you don't just fight monsters, you can also recruit monsters by using the mediator job to convince them to join you. Monsters don't have job classes, so they're very generic. They can't use weapons and armor, so they become kinda weak as you get further in the game. But they're still viable, at least some of them are viable. I've done runs in Final Fantasy Tactics where I'm using some monsters at the end of the game. I wouldn't say they're as strong as human characters, but some of them do have their uses, especially in extremely specific circumstances that can take full advantage of some of their more unique characteristics. And one of the one of the monster classes in that game is the Chocobo. And that stood out to me as a kid. The idea of being able to play a game, or not so much with that job, but basically in previous Final Fantasy games, the idea of Chocobos fighting never crossed my mind, especially because Chocobos are usually used as mounts that you ride in order to avoid battles. You ride a Chocobo and you don't trigger random encounters, or you might see one during a story sequence. But you never saw Chocobos fighting until Final Fantasy Tactics. And that always made me want something very particular. On the note of that topic, I'm not a fan of human characters in video games, or even works of fiction in general. Humans have always bored the hell out of me. When you have the option, when you have the unlimited potential of fantasy to create any kind of world you want, why would you want to be stuck playing as a human character? Especially when even when you take the most generic fantasy classes like elves and dwarves, they're just humans but better. So I've always found humans to be incredibly boring, uninteresting, uninspired, and just not as fun from an immersion standpoint as anything else. It can be monsters, it can be animals, it can be anthropomorphic animals, it can be robots, it can be aliens, it can be anything other than humans, and I will prefer it. So, in Final Fantasy Tactics, I always wanted to have a team of all monsters. I even wished I could remove Ramza from my party, just have a monster leading the party, just so I didn't have to use any human characters. Now as a kid, I sucked at the game, so I could never make that work. I think it could possibly work, especially if you get all the strongest monsters, but it would still be kinda difficult. But as a kid, I just sucked too much at the game to really get anywhere. I think the furthest I ever got was the windmill battle in the first chapter, and I just wasn't good enough to get any further using just monsters. The point, though, is the Chocobos, because Chocobos are popular. I don't think there's really any, especially if you're familiar with the Final Fantasy series, I don't think I really need to explain that Chocobos are popular. A lot of people like Chocobos, myself included. And seeing Final Fantasy Tactics with Chocobos that could fight, it made me want something that I have never seen and still to this day would love to see at some point in time. And that would be a classical Final Fantasy game, a classical turn-based game like this, like Final Fantasy 1, although probably more like Final Fantasy 5, with a job system, just very traditional gameplay, but you play as a party of 4 chocobos. And I know there's Chocobo Dungeon, where you play as a chocobo, and some of those give you party members of various characters and whatnot. And there's even the Wii Chocobo's Dungeon game that added job classes. But that's interesting, but it's close, but that's not quite what I want. I want something more like Final Fantasy V, but with chocobos instead of humans for the main heroes. And that's something that I've wanted for over 20 years. And it's one of the things that I actually remember most about Final Fantasy Tactics. I liked the game, I've beaten the game, I've done some interesting stuff in that game as far as attempted interesting challenges or tried out different jobs. I'm not really much of a challenge run person in games, but I've done little things to try and make the game a little bit more interesting on certain runs. But I digress. The point is, that game instilled that desire to see a game like Final Fantasy V with 4 chocobos. That's my number one memory, or the thing, my favorite aspect, if you will, about Final Fantasy Tactics. Nothing about the game itself, just that it instilled that idea into my head. And I've never seen something like that, and I would love to see it. I've even thought before about how it could perhaps be enough just to see a ROM hack. Just to see a ROM hack of Final Fantasy 1, 3, or 5 that just replaces the Warriors of Light with chocobos. Other than that, even the game could even be exactly the same. The games could be kept pretty much untouched. Just make that one change, and maybe change the dialogue a little bit here and there to refer to them as chocobos instead of humans in any sort of instance of dialogue that might imply otherwise. Anyway, the main reason I bring this up is because a few years ago, I started thinking about that a lot more in depth, and I started asking myself, what would I do if I were to create such a game? What would I do with it? And I came up with some ideas, mostly just story ideas, and a few ideas for the job classes and stuff like that. Job classes would be mostly generic stuff. You'd have your basic things like fighter, black mage, monk, blah blah blah. You would also have some more unusual jobs that aren't used too often. And they would have a job system similar to Final Fantasy V, where the more you use a job, you level it up and you acquire new skills that maybe you can customize by switching and swapping job abilities around, or maybe you would just become more proficient with the job. But if you change to a different job, you wouldn't be able to carry abilities over. It could go either way, honestly. But it wouldn't be a super innovative job system. The main thing I remember about the jobs was the idea I had for the Scholar job. Scholar has been in a couple Final Fantasy games. From the games I've seen it in, it's usually rather underwhelming. The idea I had for it was, in addition to its usual abilities of being able to survey enemies to get information, they would also use their tomes. Scholars usually fight using books for their weapons, usually elemental books that have elemental properties like being able to hit enemies for fire or ice damage. And I was going to take that idea and implement it in a bit of a different way, because how it was going to work is you would get tomes like the Fire Book, or the Poison Book, or the Sleep Book, And whatever weapon the scholar had equipped, that spell would become their basic attack. So if you had a scholar equipped with a Thundaga book, every basic attack that the scholar performed would just cast Thundaga on the enemies. And there would be powerful spells like that, maybe even powerful status spells. Maybe once you get near the end of the game, you might get like a death book that can instantly kill enemies, or a stop book that can paralyze the entire enemy party, stuff like that. It would be kind of an alternative to the Black Mage. More powerful in the sense they don't have to worry about magic points. You can just infinitely cast these powerful spells by just using your basic attack. So you don't have to worry about MP. But the trade-off would be that you can't change your equipment during battle. So whatever tome you have equipped, you're stuck with that. If you're fighting a boss and you have a Fire book and you suddenly attack the boss and realize, oh shit, fire heals this guy, your scholar's useless. But on the flip side, if you're fighting an enemy that's weak to fire, you can just completely obliterate them without any cost. Because instead of having to spend magic points to cast their spells, the cost, per se, for the scholar's power would be that you're stuck with just that one spell for the fight. So they would be lacking in versatility in the middle of a battle, whereas the Black Mage can pick and choose what spells he wants to use, if any, each turn. Anyway, so yeah, that was an idea I had for jobs. As for the story, this is the part that I thought a bit more about, I believe. I thought a bit about the jobs, honestly, but there's a lot of small things I don't really remember. Like, I believe I actually came up with a skill list for certain jobs, like the monk and the thief and stuff like that. But I don't really remember any specifics anymore because, like I said, this was a few years ago, and I didn't really write it down. But the story, the idea I had for the story was that the game or whatever was going to take place in a world where thousands of years ago, a box was discovered, or a chest rather, and somebody opened this chest, probably just some explorer or something who found it in some ancient ruins. And this chest happens to be Pandora's box. And when this box was opened, it unleashed monsters into the world. Before this, the world was very much just like our own. Nothing fantastical or spectacular or anything like that. No real magic or monsters or any such things. But when Pandora's box was opened, it unleashed monsters into the world. Suddenly our world was being overrun from everything from goblins to dragons. And it just decimated the world until the four crystals basically chose the four heroes to save the world from these monsters by going on a quest to shut Pandora's box, which they did. They couldn't find a way to destroy it, so they just shut it, and all was well. Some hundreds of years pass, and society adapts. Society just completely changes. Human civilization changes to adapt to this new world, because even though Pandora's box was shut, the monsters still now existed within our world. So the world adapted to that and became more of a medieval fantasy type world in response to the presence of these monsters and what needed to be done to protect people against them. At a certain point, some hundreds of years later, Pandora's box opened again, this time inexplicably. Nobody actively opened it. The seal or whatever that the Warriors of Light used to close it, it broke, and the chest opened again, once more spewing darkness into the world. Only this time, Pandora's box also unleashed the 4 fiends. And these were essentially generals of the monster army, who were created with the sole purpose of making sure that the crystals didn't interfere a second time. So 1 fiend was sent to each crystal to destroy them, or just make sure that the crystals couldn't summon new light warriors to save the day and once again close the box. But of course the light warriors come, they defeat the fiends, close the box again thanks to the blessings of the crystals, and the cycle basically repeats. And it continues to repeat every however many 100 years. I don't remember exactly how many years I settled on when I first came up with this. But after oh so often, this cycle repeats itself. The Pandora's box opens, monsters and darkness spew out, including the 4 fiends, and 4 pure-hearted humans are chosen by the crystals and summoned to gain their powers to close Pandora's box. And overall this time, nobody can really find a way to reliably destroy the box without basically making things worse. There might be a point where they consider destroying the box, but perhaps realize that doing that would then create a portal in its wake and would allow this darkness to seep into our world endlessly, because there would no longer be the box to keep it inside. So they can't come up with any solution to solve this problem permanently, pretty much. Anyway, so that would be the backstory, and the game would go to the present day where, it would come to the present day where, once again, Pandora's box is open, the Light Warriors have been summoned, and they are heading to the Earth Shrine on their chocobo steeds. 4 warriors, 4 chocobos, and they go to the Earth Temple to meet with the Earth Crystal, which has summoned them, and defeat the first of the 4 fiends. At this point in time, this temple is completely dilapidated. It is falling apart because all these battles have taken place over thousands of years within this temple. Heroes coming and going, fighting monsters, defeating fiends, and this temple at this point is completely falling apart. And so, because of that, when the Light Warriors are venturing into the depths to find the Earth Crystal, an accident occurs. The floor just crumbles out from beneath them. There's this huge cave-in, and all 4 of the Light Warriors perish in this accident. However, as if by some miracle, all 4 of their steeds happen to survive. So now the chocobos are just trying to find their way out of this place. They don't really know what they're doing. They're trained. They're very well trained, but they're still just animals. They can't think like humans do. So, with their masters dead, they're just trying to find a way out of this place. But they end up wandering deeper and make their way to the crystal room, where the Earth Crystal awaits, as does the Earth Fiend. And the Earth Fiend, presuming that these beasts must be the Light Warriors, attacks them. And these chocobos, they don't have human thoughts or instincts, but they do have animal instincts, and they have been trained to be warriors. They belonged to warriors. They were war animals, so to speak. So those instincts kick in, and they fight back. And even though they're fighting against such tremendous power, thanks solely to the fact that it's the Earth Fiend and he relies very heavily on Earth elemental magic, and the fact that the chocobos are birds and have an inherent advantage against Earth elemental magic, thanks to that coincidence, they're able to eventually overwhelm and defeat the Earth Elemental, or the Earth Fiend, or whatever. And with the Earth Fiend defeated, the crystal awakens and speaks to them, but the crystal is perplexed because these four beasts are not the light warriors that were summoned. The light warriors were humans. They were not these giant birds. So the Earth crystal kind of feels out the room, kind of gets the general vibe of what happened by sensing the emotions and the thoughts of the chocobos. And this is just a disaster because there is not enough time to find and gather 4 more people who are pure-hearted enough and strong enough to be the Warriors of Light. So, basically in an act of desperation, the Earth Crystal decides they have no choice. They need to leave the fate of the world in the hands of these chocobos. But it's not just going to thrust this upon them. It needs to make sure that these chocobos are able and willing to accept this responsibility. Otherwise, it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to work out. So it imbues them with human-like intelligence. They still can't speak because they don't have the vocal cords to formulate words, but it blesses them with human intelligence so that they can fully comprehend and consciously accept the responsibility that has been thrust upon them, and being loyal to their masters and having good, just hearts thanks to their upbringings. They accept this mission. So, basically in a desperate bid to save the world with no other feasible options, the Earth Crystal imbues the chocobos with its power, allowing them to acquire job classes and use those, and then tasks them with traveling the world, visiting the other crystals, and acquiring their powers as well to gain more job classes and more strength to eventually head to Pandora's box and once more use the power of the 4 crystals to shut it. And along the way you go through your general RPG affair of meeting NPCs, buying gear, upgrading, leveling up, going on quests, blah blah blah, but because they can't talk, they have to acquire other means of communication or conveying their thoughts to people, which would probably lead to some interesting or unique interactions or gameplay mechanics as you go. As for shops, the idea was basically that you enter a shop and the shop owner just assumes that these chocobos were sent to run an errand for their master. And so the chocobos would kind of like point out the things that they were sent to purchase, and then the shopkeeper would hand it over. But naturally, a chocobo can't use swords and armor designed for humans. So one of the boons of the crystals would be to modify their gear so that they can use the stuff. You buy a sword, and then when you equip it, it magically becomes blades attached to the edge, to like the tips of your wings, so you can slash at enemies. The shape of your armor would change from that of a human torso to a chocobo's breast, and stuff like that. So there would be sort of a magical element in place for explaining why you can go to these human shops and buy weapon and armor upgrades for your characters. And as the story progresses, naturally you would meet a character named Sid, because it's a Final Fantasy game. Through some means or another, you would be able to communicate with Sid enough to figure out how to finally put all of this to rest once and for all. Because Sid, at some point in the game, he actually discovers more about Pandora's box and a way to effectively destroy it. Because Pandora's box leads into another dimension, and it's that dimension where all of these monsters live and they're all connected. And it's theorized that if somebody could go into Pandora's box and destroy the heart of it, destroy the heart of that world, then Pandora's box would be destroyed, and that would be it. They could finally return the world back to the way it was supposed to be. But the reason this was never done in the past, because it was probably discovered at some point in the past. Sid probably unearthed it through some ancient texts or something. But the reason this was never done in the past is because humans cannot survive in that alternate dimension. However, chocobos, being monsters resultant of Pandora's box, are capable of going on that journey. So because of this twist of fate, they finally have the very first opportunity in history to finally put an end to this. However, it will come at a cost, because the monsters, just like how humans can't survive in that monster dimension, the monsters cannot survive without the existence of the monster dimension. Even when Pandora's box is shut, it's still seeping out just enough of its energy. Not enough for monsters to escape, but enough of its energy into the atmosphere to merge the atmospheres together, allowing both humans and monsters to survive in the human world. So, if Pandora's box is destroyed, all monsters in the world will slowly die off as well, including the chocobos. So the chocobos have to make this decision to save the world at that cost. Not only the cost of themselves, but the cost of all other chocobos and all monster kind as a whole. And because of their loyalty to their former masters and the loyalty they feel towards the crystals and the promise they made, they agree to do this. So the end of the game would be heading to the temple where Pandora's box is located, but this time, instead of shutting it, they would use the crystal's power to plunge themselves into the box, confront the heart of this darkness, destroy that darkness, and save the human world at the sacrifice of their own, because they realize that even though that will cause mass destruction for their own kind, the destruction that the monsters are causing is not just. That is not... They basically decide that the world needs to be returned back to the way it once was, even if that means the cost of another world, because clearly these worlds can't coexist. One is always going to be destroying the other, regardless of what they do. So they decide to make that ultimate sacrifice in order to put that cycle of destruction to an end, rather than allowing it to continue on to eternity. Especially because this chance likely isn't going to come up again. If they choose to just shut the box, there's likely never going to be another situation with these very specific circumstances that will allow for the opportunity for the box to again be permanently destroyed. And that was just kind of the idea I had for a Chocobo game. A game where, yeah, I feel like I'm trying to force an ending to this to make it sort of official. But I can't really think of a proper way to really end this per se without repeating myself and just rambling on about what I already said, because everything's already been said. I feel like I'm just trying to force a summary, basically. But then I stop and I'm like, I don't want to just say what I just said. But what else is it really to say for the sake of a summary, especially because that's what a summary is? So I'm just gonna stop. That's my idea for a Chocobo game. And again, it's just something I've always wanted to see. I've always wanted to see a game where you play as Chocobos, or maybe even not just Chocobos. I actually once had an idea for a tabletop pen and paper Final Fantasy RPG that I was going to make for my friends and I to play together. And it was going to include a ton of races. Humans were, of course, also a race, but there's also going to be chocobos, moogles, malboros, bombs, goblins, dragons, just the whole 9 yards as far as classic Final Fantasy creatures go. And character creation was going to involve choosing your race and choosing your job. And each race was going to have specific advantages. Like moogles, I think were going to be highly skilled at magic. I think chocobos were going to be real crappy with magic because they can't talk. But their main thing was that they're going to be super quick and strong. Fairly strong anyway. They're going to be like really like high dexterity, high speed characters. They're going to be really good at jobs like thief, or ones that just require a lot of agility or speed or finesse, with solid enough strength to get by without being total brutes, like you might see from something like a behemoth or a golem. And their magic abilities, they could be mages if you really wanted to, especially if you wanted to have a wit like a black mage that's super swift and good at dodging, but probably better at dodging and avoiding damage than actually inflicting damage, because they were probably going to have really low intellect stats. And also the fact that they can't talk would cause problems with their incantations. That never got very far though. That never got beyond the very earliest planning stages of just deciding what races and what jobs I wanted to have in the game. I don't think I ever really got into how character creation would specifically work, or how combat would play out, or anything like that. So let's see. We are nearing the end of this dungeon. I was thinking about ending this now because I finished talking about that chocobo idea I had a few years ago, inspired by that deep-rooted desire to always wanting to see a chocobo game. But we're near the end of this dungeon, so I'm gonna try to go over a few more of my stories throughout my history of Final Fantasy. And one of those is in relation to Final Fantasy VII. Actually, a few of those are in relation to Final Fantasy VII. So Final Fantasy VII, that's an interesting game because that game's commercials were my introduction to the PlayStation. Before I saw commercials for Final Fantasy VII, I had never heard of the PlayStation. I didn't know the thing existed. And I remember some weeks or months later going to the video store and seeing the PlayStation section and seeing all these games, and I was like, how the hell are there already so many games for this console that just came out? And I remember my mind being blown when I discovered that the PlayStation had already existed for probably a few years by this point. But I had never heard of it once until Final Fantasy VII had its commercials. And I remember the first time I played Final Fantasy VII was at a friend's house. It was his birthday, and he rented a PlayStation. It was right around the time the game came out. And he rented a PlayStation and a few games. I believe the games he rented with it were Final Fantasy VII, Battle Arena Toshinden 3, and I think a Bomberman game? I know I played a Bomberman game at his house, but I can't remember 100% if that was at that night or if it was because he later owned that same Bomberman game and we played it regularly at his house at that point. But I remember getting to his house and he had rented the PlayStation, and the idea was that we would spend the night playing that. And we did. We spent the night just playing Battle Arena Toshinden 3, basically. That was what we spent most of the nights doing. It was a sleepover birthday. That's how a lot of birthdays when I was a kid played out. My friends and I really liked doing sleepovers for our birthdays. And so he had that set up, and I remember getting there, and he was playing Final Fantasy VII. And I believe he was up to Eris's house. He didn't have a memory card, so I don't think anyway, so he couldn't save, but he was just playing the game until everybody showed up. I got there, I don't think everyone was there quite yet, so he played it a little while, and I think even when everybody was there, he still played Final Fantasy VII for a little bit just because we all wanted to see this awesome new Final Fantasy game. But I remember he was just playing that, and it was just to play it until everybody showed up. And once we settled in and everything, then we just spent the night playing Battle Arena Toshinden 3. Sometime later, a different friend, this isn't the friend whose birthday it was, but this friend was at the party. He eventually got his own PlayStation and Final Fantasy VII, and I remember he was at the final dungeon, and I talked him into going to the end when we didn't think we were ready. Here's the thing, we had read articles about the game and how you have to be level 99 to beat the game. Otherwise, you'll just get destroyed. And at that time, the idea of post-game content or things that are harder than the final boss was absurd. That just wasn't a thing that existed or really happened in games. So naturally, we didn't have any conception of the fact that information that we had read about the game was referring to fighting the Ruby and Emerald weapons, which are purely optional bosses that are significantly harder than the final boss. So my friend was only like level probably 50 or 60. And I'm just telling him, dude, just go fight the final boss. We're at the end of the game. He was staying the night at my house at this time, and he brought his PlayStation and Final Fantasy game just to play overnight. And I'm just messing with him, just coaxing him like, do it. And we both know he's gonna get his ass kicked. And that's why he doesn't want to. He's like, I'm just gonna die if I do that. But I think I just wanted to see how badly he would die. I think I just wanted to see how strong is this final boss that he gotta be max level to even stand a chance. So I talk him into it, and we do it, and he beats the final boss. We were both just completely flabbergasted. We're like, how the hell did it come to this? How the hell did this happen? Because we were both under the impression that you have to be maxed out to stand a chance, and he just kicked this boss's ass like it was nothing. Because the final boss in Final Fantasy VII sucks balls. So, we were both we couldn't believe what we just saw. We were both just blown away, completely flabbergasted by the fact that he won in what should have been just getting completely decimated. So that was really just funny, and it made my first experience with the final boss, not that my first experience beating the game myself, I didn't do that until years later on the PC version when I got that. Probably not years later, but at that age it felt like it was years later. So yeah, that just completely caught us off guard. We were not expecting to win, of all things. We were expecting it to be a total massacre on our part, and just kind of to see how long can we last before we get destroyed. But yeah, most of my experience with Final Fantasy VII was the PC version. I didn't get a PlayStation until quite a ways after it wasn't super dead at the time, but I think the PS2 might have been out. I'm pretty sure it was. In fact, I think I might have got a GameCube before getting a PlayStation. But it was early enough that new PlayStation games were still coming out, I'm pretty sure. But it was definitely at the tail end of the console having any significance whatsoever. And I got a PlayStation because there was a video game, Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories, that both a friend and I really wanted. I had the money to get it, and we saw it at GameStop, and my friend had a PS1. And by PS1, I mean the actual PS1, not the original model PS1. That's the PSX, which everybody nowadays calls the PS1 because of the PS2 and so on. But no, I'm talking the actual PS1, the little white one that was the updated model for the original PlayStation, which the proper abbreviation of is PSX, not PS1. So he had a PS1, and we saw this game that we both really wanted. I had the money to buy it, he didn't. So my friend actually told me, if you buy this game, I will give you my original PlayStation, because I don't need it anymore. I have the PS1, so my original PlayStation is just collecting dust. It's just taking up space. So I agreed to that. I bought Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories, a game we both really wanted to play, so me buying it was beneficial to both of us. And then when we got home, he gave me his PlayStation. So that's how I got my PlayStation. Well before that, though, I had the PC version of Final Fantasy VII because my brother bought it. I think he might have bought it for his birthday or something like that, or he just had some money from this or that and went to some electronics store with my dad one day and came home with Final Fantasy VII and the strategy guide. Now, our computer wasn't very good at that time. It could run the game, not on the highest settings, but it could run the game well enough to be perfectly playable. I think it would stutter occasionally, but it was fine. I didn't really have too many complaints. The one issue, though, was Chocomog. The game, if it did stutter, it was usually when casting summons, but the game would still run, except when casting Chocomog. For whatever reason, 70% of the time when you casted Chocomog, the game would freeze. So, realizing that, it got to the point where I just stopped using that spell. Whenever playing the early parts of Final Fantasy VII and I got Chocomog, I would just bench it. I would just keep it in my bag. I wouldn't even equip it. I was just like, no, I'm not using Chocomog because if I cast that stupid spell, it's just going to cause the game to freeze. Speaking of my brother and that night where my friend beat Final Fantasy VII most unexpectedly, I believe this was during the very same night. My friend was playing the game, we were in my room when my brother walks in. And my friend was in the character menu. I think he was setting up his party for the final battle or something, and all the characters were listed. And my brother asks, "Who's Yuffle?" Because he misread Yuffie as Yuffle, which is understandable. You look at an old CRT TV or old resolutions, and sometimes if the dot on an I is really close to the bar, they can sometimes sort of merge. I can see that, especially when looking back at stuff like that. I can see mistaking a lowercase I for a lowercase L because of like the picture blur or whatever. But both my friend and I just thought that was hilarious because we were dumb teenagers. So we just both burst out laughing. I think we corrected him. I can't remember 100%, but I think one of us said it's Yuffie, not Yuffle. But just for that particular moment when he came in and asked, "Who's Yuffle?" because of our age, we just thought that was the funniest thing. That was the funniest moment of the night. We both just burst out laughing when he accidentally read Yuffie as Yuffle. I also once got very angry at said friend for no real reason. When I was younger, I just tended to occasionally have angry outbursts. And there was this one time with that friend where I was playing Final Fantasy VII and I missed a treasure chest, or a ladder leading down to a treasure chest, and my friend pointed it out, and we had a slight exchange about me missing it and not noticing it because it was very obviously right there. And then I just exploded on him. And I'm like, the reason I overlooked it is because he's always telling me things like where stuff is while I'm playing games. Very backseat gaming, which was a good thing. Like, he's helping me out. He's pointing me to things I'm overlooking. He's giving me advice. Especially because back then I sucked at RPGs, so he probably knew that and wanted to be helpful. But for whatever reason, I think because it came up that I overlooked this super obvious thing, that I got frustrated, and this anger just exploded, and I started yelling at him, blaming him for me missing it, because he's always pointing stuff out for me. So I'm expecting that, so if he doesn't point the thing out for me, I just overlook it. So I kept going, so I was basically blaming me not noticing that side path and walking right past it because he didn't point it out, even though he then did point it out when I walked past it, or he made a snide remark about how I missed it. Whatever. It was not my proudest moment. It was just a random, very spontaneous, sudden fit of anger for no good reason. It's just a stupid kid being a stupid kid and overreacting to something very simple that shouldn't be a big deal. But for whatever reason, in that moment, in my stupid little kid head, it was a big deal. And I think we're gonna just about call it there. We're at the end of this dungeon. We're fighting Tiamat right now. Once we defeat her, we will have access to the final orb. Tiamat's a she, right? I feel like it's not really specified in most things, and I have no idea what the intention in this specific game is. But I believe I've seen people at least reference Tiamat in Dungeons and Dragons as female, so it's kind of assumed that Tiamat is female in other forms of media as well. But that could be completely wrong. That could be other people being wrong, and I'm just going based on what I've heard other people say, how I've heard other people refer to Tiamat as female before. Like most bosses, though, this battle isn't super tough. It's one of the tougher bosses as far as just being a raw boss fight, whereas a lot of the earlier bosses aren't too strong but rely a lot more heavily on you being out of resources by the time you reach them. These later bosses start becoming a little bit more powerful, a little bit more threatening in their own right, but they're still not super tough, especially if you know what you're doing, and especially because resource management becomes such a lesser thing at this point in the game when you have way too many resources and certain unlimited resources that trivialize your finite resources. But that's that. We completed that place. We got the final orb. And now all that's really left to do is the final dungeon. And maybe grind out a level, because I noticed that black is only level 24. And I usually like to go into the final dungeon at level 25. Because that is when white wizards and black wizards get access to level 8 spells. Yes, they'll only have one magic point for the entire dungeon, but I just don't like the idea of having spells that I just cannot use because I don't have any magic points for them. And I'm naturally going to fill out my spell books with all of the excess money I have at this point, with nothing else to really spend on it. So I'll be getting the level 8 spells, but I hate the idea of having those level 8 spells but 0 level 8 magic points. And yes, you'll get the magic points as you level up while going through the dungeon, but you won't be able to replenish those magic points, so any magic points you gain in the final dungeon are not magic points you can actually use in the final dungeon. Especially because there's no point in any dungeon where you can use a house to replenish yourself. So because of that alone, I always like to be at least level 25 before entering the final dungeon, just so I have that one level 8 magic point, so I can at least get some use out of the level 8 spells, even if it's only just that one cast. Even there, I'm checking my stats real quick to see how close I am to leveling, and probably considering doing, it looks like I'm just gonna do the level up here. So that's how we're gonna be starting the next episode, most likely getting that final level up, and with that, and then after that, it will basically be going to the final dungeon. With that, I'll see you next time.